No. Okay. Hello, everyone, wherever you may be. For some, it's pretty early, I bet. Others very late. But we appreciate that you've joined us for this webinar of the 8th International Community Psychology Conference. My name is Christopher Son. I work at Victoria University, Melbourne, Australia, on the lands of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation. As we begin, I'd like to invite Karen Jackson, Director of Mundani Balak, to do the acknowledgement of country. Thanks, KJ.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christopher. I'm KJ. I am a proud Yorta Yorta Barap woman, and I'm giving an acknowledgement of country today because it is the traditional owners who have the authority to welcome you to their country. So my acknowledgement is of country, and my authority is not within our webinar space, and it's not on the country in which I'm sitting in, and it's not in the place where you are located, but my authority is from deep in my spirit and my cultural practice to recognise, respect and honour country. Today I want to pay homage to those who knew and who know, who understood and understand, who have shared and still share country. It is to acknowledge those who have come before us and those who are pushing back against coloniality. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and I hope that at the end of today, we can all join together to change racism, to change structural violence, and to enact radical possibilities so that we can all make our Black lives longer in all of our spaces and places and on our country. I wish to pay my deepest respect to the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded land I am on today. I acknowledge the Lenni Lenape of New Jersey and the 100+ tribes of California and all the traditional owners of land from wherever you are dialing in from. Thank you for asking me to do acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend my respect to Aboriginal and First Nations people who are here with us today. Last weekend, many of you would have been here with us to engage in dialogue and critique about our conference focus, to explore the role of community psychologists to foster and sustain solidarities. This was not to be. The world is a different place now. Almost 2 years since we first imagined this, the unsettling times ushered in by the COVID pandemic. Much has been written about the pandemic, the crisis, the end of times. African scholar Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatseni raised questions about what this crisis is about. This moment, which has surfaced the realities of widening yet sedimented social racialized inequalities that mark so many nations around the world. Globally, we've also seen the resurgence and strengthening of social movements, in particular the Black Lives Matter movement, which has again highlighted the long histories of racialized oppression that has its roots in the systems of slavery, colonialism, and the current moment of neoliberal capitalism. The current moment has brought disbelief, outrage, indignation, and for many others, it has brought grief and a deep weariness threading together many painful histories. As individuals, organizations, and institutions gesture towards solidarity through admirable public statements condemning systemic racism and vowing to tackle white supremacy, we must be careful not to place racism as a distant artifact apart from us or on the outside, somewhere else, or belonging to those who are racialized. We must also not assume reflexivity or that a mere declaration of our complicity entails anti-racist practice. We must instead find ways to enact meaningful and lasting solidarities and anti-racist activisms that seeks to uproot the pernicious tendrils of our racist past in its continuities and in the present. Along with others, we are deeply unsettled by this time, about injustice, about the violence that saturates Black lives globally. Yet we are also buoyed by the recentering of long traditions of critical writing, scholarship, and activism from the margins that point to psychologies otherwise. The challenge to coloniality moves to epistemic justice and actions within, across, and beyond disciplines, unsettling ourselves, the social, and knowledge canons. Unsettling is an act of solidarity. So to help us reimagine radical possibilities, we have brought together Paola Balla, Jesica Fernandez, and Michelle Fine in conversation about critical transnational conversations on structural violence and radical possibilities. But before I hand over to Rachel Fox, just a brief note on Zoom etiquette. You'll see the buttons at the bottom, and that audience can participate in Q&A during each panel member's presentation by submitting questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered during the moderated Q&A at the end of the brief presentations. General chat can take place, and I see some of you have already started chatting and saying hello to us, which is great. And please also note that the event is being recorded and will be available via the ICCP 2020 YouTube channel. So thank you. I'll hand over to Rachel Fox now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Fox. I'm might not be obvious from my voice, but I'm in Australia like everyone else. I'm a little bit further away from all these other guys who are here in Australia. So I'm a very, very, very short 5 hours drive from the guys in Melbourne. And I'm very fortunate to live and work on Wiradjuri Nation land. So pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm here to just first of all introduce our three speakers. So I'm very excited to have Paola, Jessica and Michelle to speak. And we're just going to have Paola, Jessica and Michelle speak just a short little presentation each. And I'm going to introduce them and introduce those. And then we'll move to discussion and Q&A, and that'll form the main part of our webinar because we really want to focus on dialogue. So I'm going to get my little text up so I don't get anything wrong. But the first person I want to introduce is Paola. So Paola Balla is an award-winning visual artist, curator, writer, lecturer, and current PhD candidate, I should say, almost finishing the PhD candidate at Victoria University's Moondali Balloch Indigenous Academic Centre. Paola's research focuses on Black women's art and activism and its role in disrupting patriarchal and colonial dominant narratives and spaces. And Paola's writing has been published by The Lifted Brow, Etchings Indigenous, Writers Victoria, ArtLink, Frieze UK, SBS and NITV. So I'm going to pass over to Paola, who's going to be our first speaker. So I'll hand over to you, Paola, if that's okay.
Thank you. Firstly, hello everyone, and KJ, thank you so much for your acknowledgement, which you always do for all of us with such generosity and love. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples as the traditional owners of country here where I am, and to their unceded and sovereign Kulin country. The colonial name of where I am right now is Footscray, and I'm in the western suburbs of Melbourne, where I'm working from home like so many others, and I'm fortunate to still have work. And I'm really honoured to be a part of the webinar today, especially with Jessica and Michelle and all of you. Thank you, Chris, Rachel, and the whole committee and team for making this a reality today. It's hard missing out on gathering in person, so I think this is a real honour to be able to do this. I want to acknowledge all Indigenous traditional owners, where each of you may be at the moment, all Black peoples and people of colour, and acknowledge Black, Indigenous and people of colour who are also trans peoples, non-binary peoples and queer peoples in our communities. Over the past 5 years, as a PhD candidate at Victoria University, and specifically at Moondali Balloch, our Indigenous academic unit, I've done practice-led research project by exhibition and exegesis. And I was researching the ways that Aboriginal women in art and community resist and protect and create survivance methods to survive colonialism and patriarchy, and the very unsettling nature of colonialism in very multiple and unacknowledged ways, often particularly community women's work. And my career and artwork is really focused on these stories, which are both very personal and political. It builds on the notion of us being erased, and quite violently, from history, and erased violently through a variety of ways, through child removal, incarceration and violence against our bodies, and sexual subjugation in the history of colonialism in Australia. I practice community ways that I was taught by my mother and my matriarchs to do this work, and that guided my way. As part of my work, I created, in thinking about radical possibilities and healing and the possibility of art and art practices as healing, one of the works I created in my final exhibition was a space of unconditional love. And I named it that because of the very brilliant Professor Tracy Bunder, who's one of my co-supervisors, who kept speaking to me about that. Which really helped me find the courage to go into the very daunting work of PhD research, especially for an Aboriginal woman. University spaces are very difficult for us to navigate, and the colonial sites of power can be quite violent. In order to create this unconditional space, over a 6-month period, I created over 240 hand-dyed cloths. So I could actually manifest a 3-dimensional space that would make visible trauma trails and stains, and visualize the potential of what a healing and respite space could look and actually feel like. This is because of the overwhelming nature of transgenerational traumas that we experience, and that I needed to manifest this physical space to ease this sense of disassociation that trauma brings, and create the daily acts of repair that my brilliant colleague Kim Kruger named. These actions are necessary within the Academy to be able to thrive and survive it at the same time. Of course, it draws on Aboriginal decolonising methodologies and Aboriginal feminist standpoint theory, named so clearly by the esteemed Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson. And also to work towards art as a sovereign act and expressing our sovereignty by Professor Bunder, who names writing as a sovereign act. And also work towards the act of art as research, and research being ceremony as healing work. Of course, as Aboriginal women, we're at the intersection of colonial injuries regarding our race, our gender, class and social positioning. And I was really interested in how we subvert these various forms of art and resistance in community and cross spaces like academia, public life and social media, where Aboriginal women and Black women absolutely kill it and give us so much energy and resistance, and the ability to speak back and Black in our own ways has been an absolute revelation and revolution. However, I can't do any of this work without having the base of Meendani Balloch, our Indigenous academic space at the university, because you need a decolonising Black community Aboriginal space to lead into the very white university spaces that we are in. And because of our director, Karen Jackson's leading of us into that space and holding that space for us, I'm able to do the work that I do with community at the centre. And as I mentioned before, the unconditional love that Black women create within the university as a site of colonial power, which we've been transforming from the inside out for decades, as Aboriginal people have done across universities for decades in this country. However, I need to be able to share, I just wanted to touch on some of the incredible work that Aboriginal women activists in particular are doing at the moment in the wake, of course, of the murder of George Floyd and the events that have followed since, and look at the phenomenal work of Aboriginal and Black warrior women here who are attempting to hold up the sky for the rest of us, as Professor Tony Birch has said quite often. I acknowledge that this is such an incredibly difficult time, traumatising, triggering and transformative, when so many Black and Indigenous peoples have lost their lives in the struggle for justice, and so many have lost their lives to COVID, and people's physical and psychological health and well-being is impacted, people losing their incomes, food stability, homes, relationships and safety. And in Australia, women are experiencing, as I know they are, in the United States, Turtle Island, higher levels of violence in their relationships and homes under lockdown and isolation measures, which are designed to keep us safe, but often placing women in more danger. For Indigenous and Black peoples, lockdowns and restrictions mean the loss of gathering for healing, for culture, for wellbeing, regeneration, and for looking after elders and relatives and country itself, which is a profound injury. And many of us are feeling that quite keenly. Aboriginal people in Australia, as my mother said recently, Margie Tang, that Aboriginal people have been living under lockdown since invasion, and that we've experienced all of this before. We've experienced the end of the world before, and that genocide and colonialism continues and morphs into different shapes and structures as it requires. Aboriginal deaths in custody in so-called Australia and Black Lives Matter in so-called America are parallel experiences. We also feel the pain of Black people's genocide and First Peoples genocide there, and the profound impact that George Floyd's murder has had as a critical tipping point on top of generations of tipping points for Black, Brown and Indigenous peoples. From invasion here, our humanity as Indigenous peoples was erased, and we were described and racialised as Aboriginal, Aborigine, Native, Blacks. These terms change. As sovereign peoples from hundreds of nations, we identify in multiple and self-determined ways in our language and tribal groups as Indigenous peoples, First Peoples, Aboriginal peoples, Torres Strait Islander peoples, South Sea Islander peoples, and we are Black as well, or Black, dropping the C, as named by renowned artist Destiny Deakin in the 1990s to name the urban Indigenous lived experience. We might also call ourselves Black fellas or Black fellas, which is also gender neutral. However, our very bodies and actions are called into question repeatedly as either being too Black or not Black enough, and the dominant white discourse dictates who is authentically Aboriginal or even what constitutes racism. The white-dominated media, education system, arts and cultural institutions in this country claim to know better than us, claim to know us better than we know ourselves, and position themselves as experts on race and racism. This violence also includes indications that more Aboriginal children today are being removed from their families than during the stolen generation itself. And in the state of Victoria here, around 2,000 Aboriginal children are in out-of-home care. And nationally, Aboriginal children are 10 times more likely to be in out-of-home care. Aboriginal Grandmothers Against Removals are a grassroots group of community women fighting for their grandchildren's rights to return to family, culture and safety. And the other actions we're now witnessing and participating in are required to protest and protect communities and future generations from white colonial, institutional and settler violence and all of the tentacles that white supremacy, patriarchy and Karens attack us with. These threats are measured against COVID and known as more likely in a Black life and an Indigenous life. Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance here are a grassroots community group of Aboriginal young people in at least 4 states across so-called Australia, and in Melbourne have been led by young Aboriginal women predominantly, organising rallies in Melbourne for the past 8 years. The most recent in solidarity with Black Lives Matter rallies in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and to remind and demonstrate to Australia that Black lives matter here too, that Aboriginal lives matter. Specifically, I want to acknowledge the work of Tarneen Onus Williams, Crystal McKinnon and Mariki Onus, who named this work as generational, cultural and political in a recent article they wrote naming why they organised the rallies, because the backlash against the rallies was so fierce that they had to keep demonstrating why they demonstrated. One of the key things they said was that we must pick up the fight where our elders left off and continue their fight for justice. For us, it is not enough to just condemn the police and violence and murders happening here in the US and elsewhere. We have to take action and stand and fight against it. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and Australia's brutal legacy of police violence, Aboriginal journalist Amy McGuire wrote a brilliant rebuke to Australia's denial and the Australian Prime Minister's statement, amongst other things, that there's no need to import things happening in other countries here to Australia. Australia is not the United States. Amy clarified that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 27% of the national prison population, while 3% of Australia's actual population. In the decade from 2006 to to 2016 alone, those rates jumped by 41%. And while the focus has often been on Aboriginal men, Australia has been locking up Aboriginal women, most of them mothers, most of them victims of violence, at rates that beggar belief. Aboriginal women now make up 34% of the female prison population. At the latest census, First Nation women were being jailed at rates higher than those of both non-Indigenous women and non-Indigenous men. And nearly 3 decades after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody handed down its report, successive Australian governments have made no attempt to address its recommendations. With law and order policies electorally popular, they have only made things worse. At the Black Lives Matter rally in Australia, the Melbourne one, the latest count of Aboriginal deaths in custody was sitting at 432, and by a day later had jumped to 437. In closing, Aboriginal warriors continue to resist in multiple ways that are both personal and political. My mother's cousin, my auntie Tanya Day, in 2017, died in police custody after falling asleep on a train. Her children have taken on the mammoth task of seeking justice and responsibility for her death. Auntie Tanya was deemed drunk and unruly by train officers who had her collected by police and locked up in a police cell where she was neglected and had a number of catastrophic injuries from falls which resulted in her death. The racism of each authority figure, all white, including the train officer, the police officers and ambulance officers, all contributed to her death. Her case was the first time in Australian history that racism was considered a factor by the coroner in the coronial inquiry last year. And this work was due to the activism by her children. They also successfully lobbied to have the so-called crime of public drunkenness, which disproportionately impacted Aboriginal people. They had it abolished in Victoria after a public campaign. The final outcomes of her coronial inquiry are yet to be handed down. So far, no one's been held accountable for Auntie Tanya's death. Justice for Tanya Day, remember her name, is a Facebook page available to the public and in need of support. So please follow this account for updates. Auntie Tanya's face and campaign is on this t-shirt that I was gifted by my niece April, who's been an incredible spokesperson along with her sister Kimberly and brother Warren in fighting for the mum's justice. Auntie Tanya is not just one of those numbers in deaths in custody. She is not just a number. Her children have conducted this sustained campaign for justice for their mum, who they name as a proud Aboriginal woman, an activist against deaths in custody herself, a loving friend, community woman, and loving grandmother. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Powerful stuff. We move now to our next panelist speaker, Jesica. So it's great to welcome Jesica. Jesica Fernandez is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at Santa Clara University in California. Through the use of community-based participatory action research and rooted in decolonial feminisms, critical race theory, and intersectionality, as well as global South liberation-oriented paradigms, Jesica's scholarship strives to support and cultivate the socio-political development and healing and well-being of Latin communities, youth, and students of colour activists. So I'd really like to welcome Jesica to share her short talk. Thanks, Jesica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing a few slides as I speak, so please, I ask for your patience as I try to work the technology here. Is everyone able to see my screen or not quite?
I can see that, Jesica. I can see your desktop and the sort of window open. Yeah.
Can you see the slides now?
Yes, perfectly.
Wonderful. I'm so glad the technology worked for me today. So thank you, Chris, Rachel, and the ICCP team for organizing this webinar. I am happy to be joining award-winning artist Paola Balla and Dr. Michelle Fine. To the audience that is joining us, thank you for your presence, and may my well wishes reach you wherever you are. I am honored to be in reflection and in dialogue with so many of you across time zones and locations. I join you from a region I acknowledge belongs to the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, where I am an uninvited occupant working to decolonize the university and its complicity in colonial projects, as well as leverage institutional resources to support community struggles that challenge the manifestations of colonial power inside and outside the academy. Today, I want to speak on disrupting the assemblages of violence and the possibilities of radical rehumanizing apertures, which relate to my research on youth community organizing. In April, as many of us were beginning to see the COVID-19 crisis unfold, renowned Indian author and activist Andhurati Roy, in her essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," wrote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." In recent months, we have witnessed the rise in the number of COVID-19 deaths and its impact on communities of color, Indigenous communities, and the economically disenfranchised and those in precarious situations. We have seen how the guidelines by the World Health Organization are not applicable in the majority world, as these reflect the neo-colonial structures of Western societies. In the US, another pandemic ensued, yet it was and had always been there. Colorblind United Statesians refuse to see this, however, willfully ignoring the past and present legacies and manifestations of racial violence, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy, and the calls for Black Lives Matter as the racial violence has continued. COVID-19 made visible the coloniality of power, the violence of racism and capitalism that is assembled through the reproduction of histories, ideologies, discourses, and technologies of oppression and dehumanization. Violent assemblages manifest themselves through time, space, and place. The assembling of violence that continues and is unveiled by the pandemics of COVID-19 and racial capitalism necessitate that we face the current moment, that we, in the words of Jewish Puerto Rican feminist poet Aurora Levins Morales, craft a revolution capable of healing our wounds. If we, with and alongside communities impacted by the assemblages of violence, can dream of radical rehumanizing conditions, then we can and must mobilize in that direction. We must, as Imesisare states, live a true humanism made to the measure of the world. As a Chicana, Mexico-born immigrant to the US, I have found the writings of Gloria Anzaldúa grounding in this moment and instructive to my decolonial feminist praxis. Anzaldúa speaks to psychologies of oppression and liberation that reflect Fanon's writings, wherein he states that only conflict and the risk it implies can make human reality come true. I desire somewhere else and something else. I am fighting for the birth of a human world, in other words, a world of reciprocal recognitions. It is this world of reciprocal recognitions which Martín Barro calls for critical psychologists to cultivate. Writing in the context of the Central American Civil War, one cannot do psychology today without taking a serious historical responsibility, without trying to make a contribution towards changing all those conditions that dehumanize the majority of the population. Through these acts of reciprocal recognition and historical responsibilities, we are called as critical community psychologists to cultivate conditions, relationships, and ways of knowing and being that, as Venezuelan community psychologist Maritza Montero describes, strive for liberation. To humanize is an intimately linked political act. To give an example of a radical rehumanizing aperture, I next describe youth community organizing efforts to decolonize and transform oppressive schooling conditions into ones that affirm students' humanity. Coleman Advocates for Children and Youth is a nonprofit, multiracial, multi-ethnic community organization in the city of San Francisco that for 45 years has been building the sociopolitical consciousness, leadership, and political power of young people from predominantly African American and Latinx communities. For nearly a decade, Coleman has campaigned to restore the dignity and well-being of students by demanding the elimination of zero-tolerance policies in schools. Some of their efforts have been successful. In 2012, Coleman campaigned to institute legislation to implement restorative justice practices in school. At present, and in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, Coleman Youth campaigned for police-free schools, demanding schooling conditions with youth advocates, counselors, and resources to support students' health and overall well-being, dignity, and respect in schools. On Juneteenth, a date commemorating the 155th year of the end of slavery in the US, Coleman organized a demonstration outside the San Francisco Board of Education building. In what follows, I share a few reflections and images featuring young people holding the mic to make their voices heard. The act of speaking out, of demanding the defunding of the city's police department and a reinvestment in Black, Indigenous, and student of color well-being is an affirmation of youth's power. It is a political act of rehumanizing through direct action, coalition building, and the centering of youth's experiences, of the relational situated knowledge of students who are policed and directly impacted by, but also resisting the assemblages of violence. Youth's demands for fully staffed wellness centers, mental health resources, and youth advocates, as well as an education for liberation, for the restitution of their humanity in schools and the well-being and thriving of their communities, are actions aimed at decolonizing the oppressive conditions that have remained unchanged in education institutions. Coloniality lives and reproduces itself in the conditions and ways of knowing and being that are unquestioned and normalized. Yet young people, through art, as the work of Paola has shown, radical wit, as Michelle describes in her own work, and public acts of organized protest are responding to Sylvia Wynter's decolonial call. How can we come to know our reality outside the terms that have been adaptive to a reality? How can we think outside the terms in which we are? Now, as always, I believe our energies and resources must be aimed at cultivating decolonial conditions that rehumanize and create a just world. In learning from and working with and alongside young people, often in the context of youth participatory action research collaborations, I experience this moment as one of radical apertures. Apertures for rehumanizing enactments that affirm our interdependence, our capacity for and need to coexist with all beings in the spirit of the Mayan philosophy of Inlakesh, to embody Fanon's reciprocal recognitions, apertures for coalition building that bridge the intersections that have set us apart, that allow for co-complicity and accountability and the leveraging of institutional and material resources to support community struggles, apertures for saberes entretejidos, threaded knowledge that is relationally situated in the material, collective, and spiritual knowings that compel us to dream and imagine that another world is possible. As Robin D.G. Kelly writes, the belief that the map to the new world is in the imagination, in what we see in our third eyes, rather than in the desolation that surrounds us. Together, these practices, or as I describe them, intentions in action for radical apertures, can help us materialize the decolonial conditions that this moment demand and that our future requires. If we are to be and become more human, We must actualize the undoing of coloniality and colonialism manifested as assemblages of violence we see, we feel, and we carry. And in the words of Gloria Anzaldúa, we must act in the everyday world. Words are not enough. We must perform visible and public acts that may make us more vulnerable to the very oppressions we are fighting against. Together, we form a vision which spans from the self-love of our colored skins to the respect for our foremothers who kept the embers of revolution burning, to our reverence for the trees, the final reminder of our rightful place on this planet. Hand in hand, we brew and forge a revolution. In closing, I offer us an invitation. I invite you to consider the radical apertures you are seeing and how the pandemics call us to recommit to an activist scholarship and praxis that disrupts the assemblages of violence in order to bring into being a more just world that affirms life and human dignity. And my gratitude to the ICCP team, to Chris, to Rachel, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you who are joining in on this moment. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Brilliant. Okay, we have our final, and I should just say as well, if anybody wants to put in questions now, you're very, very welcome to. So the Q&A tool at the bottom, so not the chat, although if you put anything in the chat, we can find it and pose it as a question. But do feel free anytime you want to put your questions into the Q&A, and we will engage with them when we start to discuss. I'll hand now to Michelle Fine. So Michelle is Distinguished Professor of Critical Psychology, Women's Studies, American Studies and Urban Education at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Pioneer in the field of youth participatory action research and a founding faculty member of the Public Science Project, which we had a link to when we originally invited, and had a link to several works from Paola and Jessica as well, I should have said. Michelle's been involved with a series of participatory studies with youth and elders, working at the intersections of movements for educational, immigration and juvenile justice. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Michelle now.
Thank you, Rachel. So thank you, Rachel and Chris and Karen and Emma and Sam and Rama and Rebecca, all of you for kind of birthing a transnational space where we all might join to, in the language of Chris, to unsettle together. Karen, I want to thank you for the acknowledgement of country, and for acknowledging the Lenni Lenape, which is the land that I sit on, and for inviting us all to take seriously both where we are and then how we are together. In watching the chat start to list folks, many of whom I know from around the world, it's very moving that we are all situated in place, traumatized in very different ways by COVID, by racial violence, by important uprisings. And so in addition to those to whom we are beholden tonight, I just want to add those men and women and trans folks who are behind bars, in detention centers, in prisons. I want us to acknowledge that Breonna Taylor's, the officers who murdered her have still not been held accountable. Chris sent me a paper that he and Rama and Sam and Ann have written, and it's called Unsettling Psychology. And so, Chris, I looked up the definition of unsettling, and it won't surprise you that the definition is written from a settler's perspective. So when one unsettles, one causes anxiety and disturbs. And I think that's exactly what Paola, Jessica, and I have set out to do tonight and in our life work, to engage as critical psychologists obligated to unsettle, decolonize, document structural violence, but also capture the radical possibilities very much in our midst. Paola, I just want to say that maybe the 131 people on the call, we could all vote and just give you your PhD now, because that talk was magnificent. And Jessica, we could grant you tenure. But for the moment, I want to take all of us into Monday evening. And so Monday evening was a preparation for this conversation. And Paola, Jessica, and I stayed 10 minutes late to set up for what we would do today. And in those 10 minutes, something transformative happened, which reveals the kind of radical potential of transnational conversations. Within 10 minutes, we realized we were all bearing witness to racialized, colonial, and carceral circuits in our communities, in our nations, distinctly enacted in Paola's community, in Jessica's community, in my community, and yet networked. Police and social workers, global racial capitalism, ICE and prisons, all the front guard of white supremacy, taking babies, locking up youth, criminalizing survivors of domestic violence, and at the same time, we are all committed to documenting the vibrancy of activists and artists, of young people, of formerly incarcerated survivors of violence. So within those, I think, 60,000 seconds, we unsettled histories, structures, and lives, and we stitched together, 6,000, across communities and oceans, what I want us to think about as movement-based critical psychological studies. So Paola opened first, and she referenced the history of the stolen generation as a backdrop. And then she commented then, as she did tonight, that more Aboriginal or Indigenous children have been forcibly removed today than during the stolen generation. And on that funky Zoom space, I watched Jessica's face fall, and I could almost see and hear Central American children in cages at the border in Jessica's eyes. And Jessica spoke, "I can feel what you're saying in my body as you speak." We live in very different contexts, and yet we bear witness as the state takes children from families of color. And as her eyes welled, she grabbed her heart and she said, "I think I can feel the acid reflux." Yes, indeed, child snatching from families of color is a transnational tradition enacted by the state, and intergenerational structural violence. But in these same 10 minutes, we learned from Paola's mother, again cited tonight, that being in lockdown is not new for some communities. It's centuries-old tradition. And so we were together, the three of us, compelled to ask about the present moment. Whose crisis is this? Which crisis are we mourning? Who is unsettled for the first time? Jessica then spoke of her years of collaboration with youth organizers, and she admitted she finds much more wisdom in youth organizing than she might find in the academy. And I, in my work in the past and currently with incarcerated and now formerly incarcerated women. And so as critical psychologists, we're engaged with, not on, not for, not about, communities in struggle. And so we offer up with humility the resources of the academy and social science to document the wisdom that grows within the praxis of social movements. All three of us, I believe, are contesting what critical race theorist Charles Mills and Linda Alcoff have called epistemologies of ignorance or epistemologies of privilege. And we are instead compelled by what might be called epistemologies of struggles and victories forged at the moment of delicate solidarities. In our work at the Public Science Project at the City University of New York, before and during COVID, we have been working on decriminalizing survivors of domestic violence. We built a collaborative of lawyers and formerly incarcerated women, law students, graduate students, some of whom are on this call, Maria Elena Torre, the director of the Public Science Center, and myself. And at the center of our work is an advisory group of formerly incarcerated survivors of violence. And together we are documenting the unfolding of a radical new law in New York State called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, a law passed in New York that enables women and men who can demonstrate that they were experiencing violence when they committed their crimes to have their cases reheard. Lots and lots of caveats. The cases are reheard by the same judge and the same lawyer. We began with the spreadsheet of 487 women identified by the Department of Correctional Services as potentially eligible. We knew that between 80 and 90% of women in prison have experienced intimate violence. We know that domestic violence is a powerful pathway to prison. And we know that the global solution to COVID is literally locking women into violent homes. So with law students and graduate students and our advisory group of formerly incarcerated women, we scoured legal records and newspaper accounts for any evidence of domestic violence. Smoke signals, materials describing the law were sent into the prison, and then COVID hit. And we doubled our project, not only to find and support women who might be eligible for this new law, but also to identify those vulnerable to COVID, those who are elderly, those who are ill, those who have mental health condition, and those who are potentially eligible for the domestic violence law. And we generated those names. Again, my screen is usually filled with our advisory board, generating names and slipping them under the nose of Governor Cuomo. Every other week for 2 hours, we meet with our advisory group of formerly incarcerated women. Some are just out a month, some are out many years. Some were locked up for 8 years, some for 38 years. Half are survivors of domestic violence, and they ground our inquiry and action. We meet on a Zoom call trying to develop strategies to help women who are locked inside during COVID to develop a new narrative and consciousness of their entitlement to justice. The lawyers upstate remind us that thousands of men have applied to be eligible for this law. Many, many, many fewer women. Gender is so tied to a sense of entitlement. And women of color are so much more likely to be tried and criminalized for trying to survive domestic violence. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of the kinds of conversations we have, and then I'll close. Judy, who just celebrated 1 year out after 38 years in, reminded us most of the women inside prison have horrendous histories of domestic violence, but those who have the most horrendous histories are on the mental health unit, and they're not even going to know about this law. How do we get to them? Then Kathy added, if a woman killed someone, especially if a child is involved, she's going to be too filled with shame and guilt to even apply. It'll be triggering for her to apply. Sharon added, when we were in there, most of us were blaming ourselves. Everyone thought we were the bad women, the bad mothers. The idea of imagining ourselves, shifting the narrative to be entitled to justice, that's a lengthy process. Our lawyers, another woman said, our lawyers said, don't even mention domestic violence in the case. It's going to be used against you. Anissa adds, many women are told not to take the stand. Cheryl explained, it takes years to develop another narrative about why you did what you did. The story of blame sticks to women, particularly Black women. It sticks hard. And the whole world agrees. Judy then reminded us, there used to be a domestic violence, family violence program inside where women could attach their experiences and connect the dots to their crime, but that's been cut. They cut the DV groups to silence the women. They didn't want us to gather. They didn't want us to hear from each other. And so we're stuck with this deeply critical psychological question of, here's a law that is a radical possibility. The space between the lives of these women and this law is littered with shame and fear and guilt and responsibility, the structural violence of prison, the hauntings of crime, and now COVID. And then we turned to COVID, and Judy said, remember Martha? I think she's 72. She was arrested in 1994. She had heart failure, 2 strokes. Maybe we should try to get her out. And Kate, the amazing lawyer, called her and said, Martha, women who are now on the outside have been thinking about you. We were wondering if you would be willing to let us float your name to the governor. And Martha cried and said, I know this is really a long shot, but I can't believe all of you on the outside are talking about me. Of course, submit my name. As an interdisciplinary group with a range of experience and expertise, knowledge of life inside and out, a project centered on and by the lives of women who have been criminalized for surviving, we have built an action research collective allied with the social movement. As I mentioned this work to Paola and Jessica, I could see another zoomy embodiment of recognition and pain across borders. And for a brief moment, we spoke about how intimate violence is a steady stream, a steady bloody stream of human life, a sedimentary layers, attended to now in crisis. But as Edward Said would say about the Palestinian crisis, domestic violence is a lost cause, lost when it is not convenient for us to remember it. So I want to leave you thinking about the ways in which critically engaged community psychologists should be in the forefront of movement-based inquiry alongside movements led by those most impacted, providing the resources of the academy and insisting that the privilege of the academic space is a resource in movements for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Fantastic. So we've had 3 people speak. We want to really engage in a discussion with Michelle and Paola and Jessica. And we've got some questions, some great questions in the Q&A. Can we see everyone now, or am I just, oh yeah, there we go. I've got the wrong button pressed. I guess my first thing that I wondered whether we could do was just to ask the 3 of you if you had, and I think Michelle's actually done some of that work in her talk, but whether you had comments and questions for each other. So I don't know who, I would just open it up to the 3 of you, but whether you had anything you wanted to say about each other's work or towards each other.
I just want to express how well Michelle captured our conversation Monday at some point, about the various ways in which we are all very much implicated and in this reproduction of violence, where we don't have the choice to not engage because we are so embedded in these systems, and for some of us, a product of these very systems that we are trying to undo. And so it's a response, and it's a responsibility, and it's also something that we are called to do and engage with, given the privileges and positionalities that we hold in particular spaces. And I think for me, this is really an invitation for all of who are joining us in this conversation to really reflect on, well, what does that look like based on where you are located in this particular moment and going forward?
Paola, I'm going to ask if you wanted to say anything.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jessica and Michelle. That was so affirming. And Jessica, yeah, absolutely. When Michelle, you started to really bring back to us what we continue to speak about, I really felt that too. And Jessica, when you spoke about that sense of you know, acid coming up, and that recognition of the pain, that trauma that child removal brings. It's such an embodied experience. And I think it's very moving to still feel that across, even though we're using this technology to have these conversations, and to really feel the pain of that. And I mentioned things that you both said to my family, and because my family are now not only my family, but they're my debriefing group, they're my colleagues at home, you know, they're my fellow warriors, my family, particularly my children. So I was telling them both about this conversation and how important it is. And both of my children, you know, who are 25 and 16, have participated in on the street actions. They've carried these banners, these rallies. They are carrying this pain within their bodies. And to know that when they see these continual images of trauma to Black bodies, to Indigenous bodies, you really worry about how they are internalizing it, and the idea of acid coming up, and how do we mind our mental health and our physical, spiritual health during this time. So yeah, it's a very, very real feeling. I was sipping away on water, feeling everything come up today, and the pressure of speaking first. So thank you so much for everything you both said, and for allowing me to speak first. It's a real honor. And Michelle, what was really jumping out to me too was thinking about women being locked up for decades of time, coming to their wisdom as women at those ages breaks my heart. The thought of them, they are elders. They need to be with their families need them. They need that transmission of knowledge. And Jessica, the talk about young people, their honesty, their directness, their ability to see through everything fake and everything that's postured is so important to remember and position at the front. So thank you.
Well, since I've already done the gossip of Monday night, and it was to honor you both, but I realized I didn't have informed consent to report your acid reflux. So I'm sorry about that, Jessica. But I do think there's something very powerful about talking about these issues across borders, because there's something quite particular about our struggles that should be particular. And then the kind of racial capitalism, colonialism, misogyny, those travel across. And it's in the, psychology has few tools that help us yet think about how do we honor the particularities and speak across. And then Paola, I actually do have a question for you about art as a provocative representation of the work that you've done. And we've done some of that with performance and art, but you're deep in it. And I'd love to hear from you how, why, and if we think of provocation rather than dissemination, that the point of the kind of work we're doing, and Jessica, this is built into the kind of work you're doing, is to provoke. My friend Maxine Green would say, to provoke a wide awakeness, right? Can you talk a little bit about the move to art? And was that just like unilaterally loved in a psychology program? And educate me, go.
Thank you. Sorry, I just got, you just froze a tiny little bit, but I caught the majority of what you were saying. So thank you so much. If I can, Rachel, can I share my screen? I've just got an image of one of the works that I mentioned.
Yeah. Just click share screen, and if you just do the main share screen, that probably work.
Yeah, thank you. what I'm going to do is just share one of the works from my PhD exhibition. Are you able to see that?
Yep, yep.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Michelle. And also thank you for that comment saying that you can just, award me my PhD now. That would be nice. I'm in the last painful stage of completing the exegesis, the written component that goes with this exhibition. So that's very kind, thank you. This is a work, it's something I mentioned at the beginning as an outcome of my exhibition, and the idea of not of provoking and not disseminating. I love that you said that, because when I was conceptualizing this part of my exhibition, I wanted to create a work that was simultaneously comforting to Aboriginal people and women and very uncomfortable to settlers and to white people. And so I created this little mission hut, which is about 4 meters long, about 2 meters wide, and about 3 meters high. So it was a very small house, but it was replicating the little mission houses that our people were forced to live in after they were forcibly moved, dispersed, as Aboriginal people have been historically dispersed, moved around, and these are the kind of conditions that people were locked down in. So having to make very meagre homes from found materials, sometimes on their own homelands and sometimes on other people's homelands. And so I wanted to replicate this memory space, a vessel where I was threading together all of these notions of survival, survivance, as Weisner speaks about, and a space that was this manifestation of healing and respite, because we talk a lot about healing, but it's often not visualized. So, and I was very fortunate to visit Aboriginal women incarcerated here, about 25 kilometres from the CBD of Melbourne, is Victoria's maximum security, they call it a detention centre. It's a jail for women, and it's called Dame Phyllis Frost, and it has a high number of Aboriginal women inmates. On a visit there, I was doing an art project where we were basically just making space for women to talk in what they have there. There's an auntie there called Auntie Lynn Colleen, who's been working for decades with Aboriginal women inside, and created a room that they call a healing space. And it's a room where they can do creative projects, have meetings, their lawyers come and visit them in that room. So this room takes on all these different functions, but one of the women I met is somebody that I'd actually been to primary school and high school with. And it was this coming together where all of this grief came up, this recognition of each other. We hadn't recognized each other at first. We hadn't seen each other for a very long time. And one of the things we spoke about was that she said to me, "Sis, I can't heal in here. I can survive in here. I'm going to have to heal when I get out." And I've never, ever forgotten that. It comes to me very regularly. I think about how on earth can you survive and heal in a space at the same time. So that work was just a way to try to visualize and create, manifest a three-dimensional space to enter into. So people could go into that room, they could lie down on the floor. There was a small bed, a very modest bed. It was lined with gum leaves because my grandmother's generation lined their bedding with gum leaves from the country surrounding them to make it more comfortable. And they were making do with rations that were doled out by the government. So it also had a very strong sense of smell. Each of those cloths that I dyed were done with bush plants and bush medicine. So as soon as you went in, you were sort of enveloped in the smell of the bush and country, which is healing. And so when we're removed from it through lockdowns like this, and your movements are restricted, you start grieving for that. So yeah, I'm very interested in that notion of confronting, pushing back on, making people very uncomfortable in order to get them to the point where they understand our daily reality of discomfort.
Thanks.
I think actually I read in Jessica's work that you write a little bit as well about spaces for healing, Jessica, yeah. And it resonated with me in similar ways to what Paola has said, but also in terms of the work that all three of you are trying to do is definitely to provoke not with the communities you're working with, but with others who need to pay attention and learn from. But you did write a little bit about how in doing that work, often the research that it might be badged as research, and that all the agendas that come with traditional research and the academy that you might be doing that work in, it doesn't naturally create spaces for healing. I just wondered if you had, you wanted to speak to that a little bit about that sense in which you're working in very sensitive, difficult work with community, that there are lots of research agendas that make healing and space for that difficult.
They do. In my experience, I have worked both with predominantly Mexican immigrant mothers in a gentrifying community, trying to create opportunities for them to create art that reflects not only their hopes and dreams, but also their possibilities for healing. So we've engaged in mural making to have them tell their own story. And through that process of storytelling, which sort of reflects what Michelle was describing with the women who are incarcerated, the power of storytelling in and of itself can become a very process of healing that is done collectively, intergenerationally. That's been one context where both art itself has been a tool to heal, but also a tool to, as Paola describes, kind of unsettle the outsider gaze and also bring in the institutional stakeholders into a conversation about what needs to change to improve the community conditions. And similarly, in the context of university settings, I shared a paper about 2 years ago that Michelle was a part of that workshop session, where students themselves were creating spaces and healing circles of affirmation within the university setting that they themselves had identified as being a very oppressive and very dehumanizing space. And so we invited a local healer, a local practitioner that engaged all of us collectively in what she described as a healing practice, a limpia, to sort of cleanse the energy of the small space that we were given in the basement of the university. We set up an altar and we created our own sort of room to allow for these stories to unfold, and also to imagine a different kind of university, right? What would the new university look like, the third university, as La Paperson writes? And so part of what Michelle and Paola's work is bringing up for me is the power and the importance of intergenerational dialogues and conversations, the power and the strength of women, of elders, and also of youth that come together, and also art, how itself as a tool for healing, but also as a tool for resistance.
There's a couple of questions that I am going to put from the Q&A in a minute, but just to keep that flow, the other thing that sprung up to me as you've all talked is the extent to which, because all your work really works hard at moving away from the academy, the university, however we might describe it, into community. And I think you might have different responses for this, but the extent to which the academy follows you, comes with you in different ways, the extent to which you might sometimes be positioned, I think I've read this a little bit in some of your work, but you may feel differently about this, but sometimes you may be positioned as expert, which you would be trying to get away from, actually. And also, you all do your work to a lesser or greater extent from a university. And I just wondered what barriers have come from that, but also what opportunities for transformation you might have found.
Yeah, I can dive in. So I think of the university as a contradiction-filled assemblage, like Robin Kelly, who talks about maroon spaces, or Fred Moten, who talks about the undercommons. I think there are radical cells within universities. I do not believe we are going to transform the large institution, we should keep trying, but I also do think we should be carving out spaces and insisting, particularly public universities have an obligation to communities in struggle. And I'm not interested. The university is a white, patriarchal, hierarchical, anti-disability, colonial institution. We got that part. Can we exploit the resources of said institution to ally with movements? And there's a volume by Kapoor and Jordan, and it on kind of critical community research, and it opens with a chapter by the MST, who are the landless peasant movement in Brazil. And in that chapter, they're very explicit that the university owes it to movements and marginalized communities to lend resources in solidarity with and to be led by those movements. But I don't want to abandon what constitutes knowledge, even what's defined as like objectivity or generalizability or validity. How dare psychologists think they can go into other people's neighborhoods, get inter-rater reliability because 3 people like me agree about what's going on in that community. So I'm about queering all of those notions, but not sacrificing it. And there are a million struggles in everything that I've said as if it's simple. Who gets credit for this story? Why am I talking about it and the women who are incarcerated aren't on the screen? How do we get through ethics and IRB? We pay everybody for everything, and everybody gets authorship for everything. And there are delicate questions of which knowledges are sacred. But I don't want to reproduce epistemologies of privilege as though that is just academic knowledge. I think those of us who are lucky enough to be allied with social movements have an obligation to do this kind of work. I know Brinton Likes is on. I mean, there are so many of the people, Regina Langhout, there are so many critical psychologists who are working alongside movements, and we should be exploiting the resources of our institutions, particularly today, maybe always, but particularly today, when we know the inequities are so severe, so raw, and people are just in such pain.
Can I jump in?
Jump.
Yeah, I have no, I really don't have any interest in the exhausting work of trying to completely decolonize an institution like a university. As you said, they're immovable kind of monoliths to white men. And we know that in Australia, as around the world, you know, the so-called Big Eight in Australia, or predominantly led by white, very wealthy men. So that's a whole other project. I love being, as I said earlier, that space of Mindani Balak, you know, is our radical Black-centred Aboriginal Indigenous cell, our space, where we laugh loud, we talk loud, we're disruptive, we invite community. We've had many, many instances, as I'm sure, Jessica, you could talk about, where white people have shushed you, closed their doors loudly, been annoyed because we're laughing or we're gathering or we're eating, and we have people other than academics in the space with us, because we are breaking that space open all the time, saying we come as collective people from collective people. So we're not going to let ourselves be isolated and categorized out into the, you know, the structure, the colonial structure that the university is. So just by being on campus and being ourselves is a radical act, which I really enjoy. And I think that also, because I work as an artist and curator and in the creative space, I actually feel that I can achieve more by being in that space at the university, particularly at Mindani Balak, than I would if I was to get a lead curator role in an arts institution, for example. All institutions are violent. They are all violent. So I just think that I'm able to maneuver, shift, push back and do a particular type of work with the phenomenal people who were in our unit and learn from them, from the generational knowledge that they offer. And that's really exciting. And Jessica, when you're speaking about, you know, converting this room and having an altar, you know, one of the things that we're able to do at the university, because Karen Jackson has fought for it, is that we have a smoking pit. We have a space where we can have a smoking ceremony, and KJ will do that for us regularly when we need to acknowledge grief, the passing of a community member, which is very often the struggle and stress of just being in the academy. Teaching while Black, teaching while Indigenous is exhausting. The microaggressions, the racism from colleagues and students is relentless. And it is exhausting work. So it's really important to have these spaces to be able to come back into yourself. And the strange looks you get when you're on campus outside and we're smoking ourselves, you know, we're connecting with ancestors, with the traditional owners of that country, their ancestry, our own, because we're often Indigenous people from all different places coming together to work together as well. So we're recreating family, recreating community and space. And sometimes to see people's faces when they walk past us and they can't figure out what we're doing, there is so much that is blackly funny about surviving in white institutional spaces, that is a way of thriving as well, to find that humor. So yeah.
I loved what you described, and I could almost envision it, because that to me speaks to how I see myself within the university as a physical space. What can I do now as a faculty member to support and create these cracks and these apertures and fractures within the university physical space and its programming and everything else, curriculum, so that students can feel whole and human and seen and included? That's what I see my role within the physicality of the university space. Now so when you were speaking about students and the, you know, coming together and building community and the smoke room, that's beautiful. I don't think Santa Clara would ever allow such a thing. I should say that I am on a literally in a colonial physical space. It is a mission. So there's this long history of violence. And so part of my responsibility is to remind and consistently bang the university on this notion that there's an ongoing presence of violence here. And so where can we make these cracks and make these rooms for healing and for students who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are Latinx, to feel seen. And to the question about the academy itself, I've had many conversations with so many mentors about, you know, the role of the academy and its complicity in reproducing these various forms of violence. And when I was starting my graduate training, I was fortunate to work with Dr. Regina Langhout, and was informed so much by the work of Michelle Fine and Brenton Lex and so many others about subverting the academy and leveraging its resources and its tools and tweaking them and querying them, and then giving them and sharing them. So one of the values that I bring into the work that I do when connecting and building and collaborating, it's really about connecting and building a relationship with community members in struggle, is how can I share what I know, and how, more than anything, what am I going to learn? How are we going to learn together? And how are we going to build and co-create in such a way that I can sustain their struggles, as opposed to any kind of agenda or theory or growth of the academy and the discipline itself. And so I've always seen myself as doing this sort of kind of shape-shifting or nepantlera kind of work, as Anzaldúa describes it, of moving in between these spaces and bringing in from the academy, taking out resources, funding, whatever it is that the community needs, that I can bring that on to support their work, and then see where that I take my lead from the communities that I'm collaborating and connecting and co-building with. And that's something that the academy, that the university, that the discipline itself of psychology doesn't always recognize as knowledge, as valuable work. And it's also part of the reason why I am not in a psychology department, but I'm still doing the critical, unsettling, unsettling psychology kind of work. It's a tricky dance.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to summarize a couple of the questions. I hope I don't do so poorly. And it would be great for everyone to continue this discussion on the Slack window that we've given everyone a link to. So if I have misrepresented a question, please repost it onto Slack and we can continue to engage with it. And it does actually lead on a little bit from what you've been saying, and some of what you've said is actually probably already described an answer to these questions, but they really relate to some practical ideas, tools, processes for engaging. One of them was on campus with students, and I think from a student, about Black Lives Matter movement and what can be done on campuses. And one was more in relation to the global pandemic. So bringing the ongoing lockdown of the oppressed to the fore, and practical tools that you would suggest. So I guess it's asking about some practical things. And I'll just, sorry, that is the question, but I'll just also say a few people have asked about resources that you three might recommend, and that probably relates to some of these practical tools. And I wondered if I could just confirm or ask whether you would mind probably sharing those, any practical resources that you have. We can put them onto Slack, which would be great. I think people would love to see things that you would recommend. Yeah, but yeah, what kind of things you would say about being on campus with students and also being out in community?
What would I say? I think get active. I think that universities have become so corporatized and privatized, in a sense that in many ways they've become depoliticized. And I worry for students feeling silenced on campuses. I started university in 1993 and I was very, very fortunate to be surrounded by people like Professor Gary Foley, the late great Lisa Belair, Auntie Ella Pitt and Auntie Eleanor Harding, who were visiting campus, and these generations of Aboriginal sovereign warriors who'd done the work. And we're seeing the university site as a place to gather and to activate. And I think that needs to happen again. So I think for any allies or people wishing to do that work, seek invitation first, and only ever be guided by the local Aboriginal community in that space. Listen, really, really deeply listen and sit back. A colleague of ours, a white woman, Dr. Claire Land, wrote a book, Decolonising Solidarity, which is a really great guide. It's very practical in how to attempt that work. And the other thing is, if you're not reading, they should be reading this. They should read this, and they should read this. These are my like babies, and of course this. I know this is extremely daggy and not very technical, but these books give me life. Books gave me life as a child. Books and reading gave me the respite, the window, and the escape from the trauma that I was experiencing. Making art did that. It gave me the space to respond. to the relentless nature of colonial violence against Aboriginal bodies, against Aboriginal women's bodies, Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, and find your heroes. Find them in these books, because they will guide you through. Purchase Black literature, read it, devour it, talk about it, create Black book clubs. But ultimately, you know, we're exhausted. And so the irony is, being an educator, you get exhausted of educating white people and how to try to de-escalate their violence as white people. Yeah. But be guided by invitation. Do not jump ahead of Aboriginal people. If you feel impatient, that you feel like they're not taking action quickly enough, even for settlers of colour, other people of colour, you have to wait for local Indigenous peoples' movements and way forward, and be patient, and don't time Aboriginal people against the clock watching Western concepts of when things need to be done. The gatekeeping of time and the gatekeeping of progress and so-called success, I'm not interested in that. We get guided by our elders and community and deep time in how to be patient and when it's the right time to do things. So yeah, sorry, they're very obscure answers apart from the book references.
And I appreciate what you shared, Paola, because it's definitely about invitation, and it's really about humility and how you approach and connect with a community and begin to build on that relationship. I teach a community-based research course, and one of the very first things I tell my students is, I tell them you need humility, and you need to be comfortable with not knowing how this is going to go. Mm-hmm. And you need to be open, and you need to listen in order to understand, and in order to unlearn and co-learn. So initially students are very unsettled by that, because they think it's going to be like their sociology class, where they come up with a question and a theory and then the method, and then there's this kind of systematic process. But I tell them all of that stays outside the door, because that is not how we are going to approach, or what community-based research is really, you know, from the standpoint and paradigms and epistemologies from where I teach. And at first there's a lot of hesitation in that process, but as they continue to develop relationships and build projects within communities that they themselves are already a part of, many students do projects within the university itself, they begin to see how it's so different, and it's much more affirming and healing and transformative. And speaking to the question about how to get involved within the current moment with university movements for Black Lives Matter, as we were transitioning to online learning, my community-based research methods course was wrapping up. And I had a student who was working on documenting and through testimonia methodologies, the experiences of Black women on campus. And what were these experiences of racialization like? And as she was wrapping up that project, and then as COVID-19 hit us, and then the death of George Floyd and the death of so many others, just week after week, just a few weeks apart, the students, this student who was a part of the Black Student Union and other students wrote a statement to demand the university break its ties with the city police department, and to really begin to interrogate the kind of policing that takes place on campus. So here we have students mobilizing themselves, utilizing the tools that they've learned through these participatory based research methodologies to then push for an initiative and develop a campaign and a petition to hold the university accountable and try to disrupt that relationship. And so that's one recent example that I can think of, the ways in which students are responding and engaging with the current moment and utilizing tools, making them their own to push back against these structures of violence.
I love what you both said. I just want to add a couple of quick unformed thoughts. One is we need to do much more thoughtful, hard work on whiteness, supremacy, privilege, entitlement, fragility for sure, but paranoia, narcissism, everyday enactments. We need to understand the ways in which whiteness is embodied, enacted. This has been the summer of Karens, of, you know, white women doing incredible, pulling guns, calling cops, because we feel nervous, anxious. So, and one of the things that's forcing me to think is that maybe we need to say goodbye to Yuri Bronfenbrenner's macro, meso, micro, because these dynamics are happening across levels, and it's kind of interesting to think across scale, but in the intimate, we are watching the enactments of racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy. So that's one piece of work that I call myself and colleagues to do. The second is what I mentioned earlier, really movement-based research. We're lucky in New York, there are a lot of youth, prison abolition, defunding of police groups that are looking for research. Brett Stout is working on, if we pull cops out of schools, what are we putting in place with community-based restorative practices? Monique Guichard has been doing community-based ethics boards for hospitals, so that the community reviews the grant proposals that are going on, and they are asking questions of the doctors saying, you say you're studying diabetes, but I heard you're talking about schizophrenia. Those are my grandmother's and my auntie's blood and bones you're examining. So movement-based research. And the third is this issue I was talking about, that we're bumping into the prison. The women who are currently in prison don't automatically, the way we do, connect their domestic violence to their crime. Like, they haven't sat in 1,000 critical race, feminist studies, decolonizing, whatever classes, and saturated in shame, responsibility, and guilt. We need to be doing much more popular education that moves back from symptom, your auntie, Paola, right? It moves back from symptom to structure, to history, to oppression, to resistance, because we are now flooded with symptoms. You know, Gramsci said, in crisis, you're flooded with morbid symptoms. We've got them. And psychologists mostly separate symptoms from structures and history and struggle. We've got to make sure to suture those back. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Michelle. We have a number of other really wonderful questions, but I think we're going to run out of time. It would be wonderful we're going to put those, I think, on the discussion forum that's now type-based. It would be wonderful for Michelle, Jessica, and Paola to speak to those, but it would also be wonderful for anyone to respond to those questions. I think it would be really great for everyone to post resources that you feel you have, and also work that you feel that you are doing that has connections to the work that Michelle, Jessica, and Paola have shared. I'm not suggesting Michelle, Jessica, and Paola do all the work on that discussion forum at all. But there were some really wonderful other questions, so I apologize to the audience that we didn't get the time. I mean, days and days worth could go by of having this fabulous discussion. Thank you so much, the three of you. I believe I'm handing over to Chris, who is going to sort of sum up and close with.
Thanks, Rachel, for such a gentle holding of all of us.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm probably not going to sum up. That's going to be impossible for me. to do. But can I just say thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you guys have shared, Paola, Jessica, Michelle. Thank you to all the people who have joined us. I've seen people from Brazil. I know that my colleagues and friends and family in South Africa have stayed up pretty late to be here with us. Thank you to Emma and her team for making this possible for us. We have been hoping that we'd be able to come together for ICCP 2020, and I think virtually we've been able to do that now. This has worked out exactly as I have imagined. It has unsettled, and I think that we are all, based on our different location, been differently unsettled. I think the comments and the questions and the sorts of theoretical provocations that have been offered is asking us to think beyond, outside, through our disciplines, through its decadence, through psychology's decadence, perhaps. It's asking us to do that work, as Michelle and others have said, at the hyphen of the university and the community, and to engage critically with that space. Paola said to push back against the neoliberalism that's regulating and managing the lives of us at institutions, but to continue to create spaces and to open up spaces and possibilities for people to imagine otherwise and to think otherwise. I think the affect, the emotion of being with others, being in place with others is so important and such hard work. And I think to relinquish, some of the ways in which we are encapsulated by our methods, by our training, by our theories, we need to push through that. I think there's so many more things that I can say, and I just want to say thank you so much for this provocative conversation, and thank you again for all of the people who have joined us. We've got an idea now about what is possible, and we are going to push forward with ICCP 2020 and how we can host these panels. And I think it just looks like it is going to have to be a virtual event into the future. But watch the space because we are going to be back soon, I hope. So thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel and Chris, really. And Jessica and Paola.
Thank you.
This is the beginning.
Thank you so much. So much gratitude. My well wishes to all of you. I hope you all and yours are healthy and safe.
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe and well, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks.